Fágan achan gíomhra, a lura gur ma flathúlacht, frun líteach rán ma éile, I dtítear sa lúbthacht ma réige, Iríam seang smolchatte, tagam chuig de duras cúachta, faoi leathléin agus faoi cur a géal an ghíomhre. Buan díam a rá, rich ma cuid berla dús. Tuckal merigh ma chuid Francíse, le bar d'ingine, go ditche skinne na teanga sin díam. Fág préachta mé, in glascléis na Gaeilge. Dúisigh, curraigh mé a haisce. Tá sé an am airg. Each winter takes its toll on my generosity. The branches of my giving tree get less inclined to yield. Sun-starved, half-stooped, I fetch up on your doorstep with my dubious world-weariness and all the season's airs. Strip from me, dear heart, the thin veneer of English. Pick off with your fingernail flakes of rusty French. Leave me peeled and shivering with the green buds of Irish. Rouse me, bring me forth, my love. It is time for spring. Díomh agus fáilte chuig Words That Burn, the podcast taking a closer look at poetry. It's Seachtain Na Gaeilge here in Ireland, or Irish Week. I thought that would be the perfect time to introduce a little more poetry os Gaeilge to the podcast. This week's beautiful poem is from Caitlín Nic Íomhair, and it's called Doineann, which roughly translates to foul weather or storm. This episode might be a little shorter than the average, but I plan on publishing another Irish language episode before the week is out. It's important to note that the English version of this poem was translated by noted Irish poet and editor Colette Bryce. This was done for the phenomenal anthology collection called Calling Cards, published by the Gallery Press. If you're looking for more Irish poetry, I strongly recommend you start there. Before we continue, you'll have to forgive me. It's been a long time since I've spoken Irish at length, and it's Ucla Mará, I'm a little rusty. My pronunciation might not be entirely up to scratch, and for that I apologise. I also apologise if the initial reading of this poem and its pronunciation made you wince. I'm sorry. My analysis will also focus on the English version, which I realise is ironic given the message of the poem. There are few voices in modern Irish language poetry that carry an edge quite like Caitlín Nic Íomhair's. She brings a contemporary poetic structure and style to an exceptionally old language, and the result is a form of verse that's both lovely to listen to and to read. More importantly, she brings a modern sensibility to discourse around the language itself. It wasn't so long ago that Irish newspapers and think pieces were filled with cynical, self-congratulatory articles calling for the removal of the mandatory requirement for the language to be taught in schools. Such pieces were filled with cries of "a modern Ireland needs to leave its old language behind." This style of article was particularly prevalent in the early 2000s. Maybe a hangover from the Celtic Tiger glory days. I'm ashamed to admit that as a teenager at the time, I sometimes echoed, or rather parroted, this sentiment in an attempt to be a cynic myself. All this was despite the fact that I had been attending an all-Irish education for my entire life at that point. Now, however, I've come to understand the importance of the Irish language, not only to our culture and history, but as an important part of my own identity. It seems that Caitlín Nic Íomhair has always understood this. Since she began writing, she has always staunchly stated the case for the Irish language and the need for it to find equal footing with English in Irish society. In 2016, right when the tide of the discourse around Gaeilge was turning in its favour, she wrote, "Bilingualism should, at this stage, be a fact in Irish life. It should be fitted into our infrastructure and forgotten about. It should be a reflex, not an afterthought. But it simply isn't." If there is a hint of defeat in these words, this poem is surely a rallying cry against such fatalism. Before we continue, I have a favour to ask. If you've been enjoying this episode so far, or even if you're a regular listener, please consider leaving me a review wherever you listen. It really does help to get the podcast out to more people. With that being said, on with the show. Doineann centres around the changing of the seasons and the odd sense of destruction each one can bring. It continues one of the world's oldest love affairs, that between Gaeilge and nature. Irish poetry and storytelling has always had a special place for nature, or nádur. That aspect of the language by itself has enjoyed a phenomenal resurgence in the last few years. The likes of folklorist and linguist Moncán Magan's 32 words for field are treasure troves of forgotten links between the Irish and their landscapes. In one article for the Irish Times, Magan put a question to his audience. He wrote, "What if we've been looking at Irish through the wrong lens all these years? Rather than it being a subject that causes heartache in schools, might it actually be a periscope into our psyche and our souls? A path towards an entirely fresh way of seeing reality, transforming existence from a predictable and quantifiable 3D dimension into a vacillating, multi-dimensional realm with the potential of bleed-throughs from other parallel worlds." This may seem a hyperbolic or excessively exaggerated statement, but once you begin to understand the multifaceted and endlessly descriptive nature of Ireland's native language, you'll understand that it really isn't. Magan's point is exactly what Nic Íomhair is articulating in her poem. The first stanza makes it clear that the speaker needs a change, a shift, and they know exactly where they will find it. Fágan ach an gíomhaire, a lurg ar mo flathúlacht. Sprun láitse crán mahéile, idítir salúbacht mo réige. Each winter takes its toll on my generosity. The branches of my giving tree get less inclined to yield. Nic Íomhair is creating a highly metaphorical image with her winter here. It could easily be seen as a simple analogy for linear time relentlessly marching forward. Each fresh year makes it difficult for our speaker to do something. The speaker themselves are one with nature. They are the giving tree. Each year their branches refuse to yield that little bit more. But what would they be yielding to? The English language, of course. The first stanza of the poem echoes Nic Íomhair's own comments quoted earlier in this episode. The speaker is tired of their native language being an afterthought. They wish it could be their primary tongue. The older they get, the harder it becomes for them to accept English as a first language. The toll this endless winter is taking on them is clarified further in the next stanza. Iríam seang smolchache. Tagum chuig de duras cuachta. Fui leithlein agus fui chur I gael an ghivre. Sun-starved, half-stooped, I fetch up on your doorstep with my dubious world weariness and all the season's airs. That sun-starved quality is once again intensely metaphorical, possibly the poet's comment on how few sources of Gaeilge there are in Irish society, how few places of nourishment exist to practice their language, to affirm their identity. The poet herself has been very vocal on the lack of publishing resources available to Irish language writers, something that is thankfully now being rectified. Our speaker talks of fetching up on the doorstep of some mysterious figure. If we continue our deeply metaphorical reading of the poem, it's possibly the Irish language itself. The speaker cuts a sad figure, as they are dubious, unsure, and world-weary, and yet they trust this person's home to restore them in the next stanza. Buan dím a rá, ric ma cuid burla dús, tuckle merig ma cuid francíse, le bar de ingene, go ditche skine. Strip from me, dear heart, the thin veneer of English, Pick off with your fingernail flakes of rusty French. We see from our speaker's words that English was never their true language. At best, it is a thin veneer hiding their true tongue. Sentiments like this place the poem firmly within the canon of decolonial or decolonising thought. Decolonial thought is a hotly contested topic at the moment, but one that has been gaining rapid ground on social media platforms, particularly TikTok. As such, it can be difficult to define. However, I find this brief and succinct definition from the SOAS group at the University of London particularly useful. They state, it begins with the assumption that global histories of Western colonial domination have had the effect of limiting what counts as authoritative knowledge, whose knowledge is recognised. In essence, decolonial thinking is a call to remove the colonial lens from your internalised thinking and understand that there is more than one way to see the world. In a country like Ireland, where colonial legacy looms large and bitter, our native language often becomes a tool to decolonise our minds. Caitlín Nic Íomhair understands that perhaps a little better than many Irish language poets, as she herself came to the language later in life. Born a far cry from any Gaeltacht, she grew up in County Down, where Gaeilge is not even allowed on the school syllabus in certain areas. Nonetheless, she fell in love with the language and her passion fueled her fluency. Perhaps this is the reason she refers to the language like a lover when she says, "my love." Our speaker recognises that English is not the only veneer that Irish people are forced to wear. There is a reference to rusty French. My own personal reaction to this was laughter, as many Irish people were the unwilling speakers of rusty French for their final examinations. For our speaker, though, it may have been another forced upon language that blocked access to their own. The final stanza is endlessly hopeful. After all this breaking down and tearing back, it turns out that under all that bark and rust was an eternal spring. Na teanga sin dim, fog preach de me, in Losh Gleish Na Gaeilge. Dúshig, churig me a haske. Tá sé an am arig. Leave me peeled and shivering with the green buds of Irish. Rouse me, bring me forth, my love. It is time for spring. Our speaker will take their dismantling, as long as it leaves them with their native tongue, their buds of Irish. Their shivering is a sign of life and acts as an abstract refrain for the second last line. Rouse me. Bring me forth. Their true identity has been waiting, asleep. But now their time has come. Gaeilge will bring them back. The final line ends perfectly. It is time for spring, and so, time for Gaeilge to take its rightful place. I cannot think of a better poem than Doineann for Seachtain Na Gaeilge. It is not some rousing rebel song or war cry. It does not keen or lament the loss of a language as though it has died. Instead, in Caitlín Nic Íomhair's poem, Irish is a living, breathing and transformative thing. It is a force that quietly insists on itself and shows that the language hasn't gone anywhere, but instead is waiting for a chance to bloom again. Caitlín Nic Íomhair is a poet who writes proudly, beautifully, but most importantly, passionately in her native tongue. It is a pleasure to read her verse, which is all at once full of reverence for the ancient language, paying homage to its ties to nature and the divine within it. But at the same time, it is electrifyingly modern in its structure, carving out its place in today's Ireland. This tumultuous balance that the poet strikes perfectly embodies the storm of the poem's title. What did you think of the poem? As always, this is my interpretation, and I'd love to hear yours. If you'd like to hear more poetry os Gaeilge, I've included a few of my other episodes on Irish language poets below in the description. Just click on the links to hear the episode. If you'd like to get in touch with me, there are a few ways to do so. You can reach me directly by email, wordsthatburnpodcast@gmail.com. You can get in touch through the podcast website, www.wordsthatburnpodcast.com. I'm on Twitter, or X, @WordsThatBurn. I'm on Instagram, @WordsThatBurnPodcast, and TikTok, @WordsThatBurn2. If you'd like to read the script for this week's podcast, complete with citations and sources, check the Substack link in the description. As I said previously, if you enjoyed this episode or know someone who might, please consider sending it to them directly, or leaving me a review wherever you listen. Words That Burn is written and produced by me, Benjamin Colopy. Gur míle mágat as ach de cuid am is ara a ríis.